The gritty sensation of sandpaper rubbing against my corneas was the first warning that my body was failing the test of endurance I had forced upon it. I sat rigid in the center of the studio apartment, my fingers digging into the cheap fabric of the sofa until the nails threatened to snap. The digital clock on the microwave flickered with a mocking red light, marking the seconds that felt like hours, while my chest heaved with shallow, terrified breaths. I had taped my eyelids earlier, a desperate attempt to cheat the rules, but the duct tape had peeled away in the humidity of my own panic. Every instinct in my biology screamed for me to close my eyes, to wash the dryness away with a single refreshing blink, but I knew the consequences. The room looked normal at a casual glance, filled with the mundane clutter of a lonely life, but the spatial dimensions were playing tricks that defied physics. When I first sat down, the television stand was a comfortable 6 feet away, resting against the far wall with the peeling beige paint. Now, after 3 accidental blinks caused by the stinging sweat dripping from my forehead, the stand was close enough that I could kick it. My brain wasn't lying to me, despite what the psychiatrists had whispered to my parents in those sterile white rooms years ago. The walls were not stationary barriers. They were predatory jaws waiting for the moment my vigilance faltered to clamp down. I reached for the bottle of saline solution I had placed on the coffee table, my hand trembling so violently that I knocked over a stack of unread mail. The sound of the envelopes hitting the floor was disproportionately loud, like gunshots in a canyon, echoing off surfaces that were too close to be real. I blindly grasped the plastic bottle, tilting my head back and squeezing a stream of artificial tears into my burning eyes. Without closing them, the relief was temporary and stinging, blurring my vision for a terrifying moment where the world became a watery smear of colors. In that split second of distorted sight, I saw the geometry of the room shift again, a lurching motion like a beast settling into a crouch. The coffee table, which had been inches from my knees, suddenly pressed against my shins with a bruised, dull thud that vibrated up my skeletal structure. I yelped and scrambled backward, pushing myself up the back of the sofa, but the wall behind me was already there to meet my spine. It felt warm, alarmingly so, radiating a heat that suggested biological processes rather than plaster and insulation. I turned my head slowly, trying not to break my visual lock on the room in front of me, and pressed my ear against the drywall. Instead of the hollow silence of an empty building, I heard a low, rhythmic thrumming, like the beat of a massive, subterranean heart. Panic began to override my logical planning, sending surges of adrenaline through my veins that made my extremities numb and useless. I needed to get to the door, but the path that had been cleared 10 minutes ago was now a claustrophobic obstacle course of compressed furniture. The armchair had fused with the bookshelf, the wood and fabric twisting together in a grotesque embrace. It looked like a transporter accident. I stood up, my legs wobbly, and tried to navigate the narrowing gap between the sofa and the mutating furniture. My eyes were burning with a fire that made me want to claw them out, the urge to blink becoming a physical pain that radiated into my jaw. I took a step forward, and my foot caught on a rug that had bunched up into rigid, calcified waves, sending me sprawling toward the floor. I threw my hands out to catch myself, my palms slapping against the hardwood that felt sticky and yielding, like drying resin. The impact jarred my neck, and for a fraction of a second, the shock forced my eyelids to flutter shut. It was instantaneous, a shutter click of darkness, but the change was violent and immediate. The ceiling dropped a foot with a sound like cracking bone, and the air pressure in the room spiked, popping my ears. Scrambling to my knees, I realized the door was now the only goal, the only salvation from a space that wanted to crush me into a dense cube of meat. I lunged for the brass handle, my fingers slipping on the metal, which was slick with a condensation that smelled faintly of iron. Twisted it with all the frantic strength I possessed, but the mechanism was frozen, fused by the immense pressure of the warping doorframe. I kicked the wood, screaming a raw, guttural sound that was swallowed instantly by the encroaching walls. The door didn't budge. Instead, the wood seemed to groan, bleeding a dark sap that ran down the panels like black tears. I spun around my back, pressed against the unyielding door, and stared at the nightmare unfolding in my living space. The window, my secondary escape route, was undergoing a horrifying transformation as the glass turned opaque and milky. It wasn't breaking. It was thickening, rippling like disturbed water before solidifying into a substance that looked licked. The air was becoming heavy and thick, difficult to pull into my lungs, tasting of ozone and stale copper. I grabbed the heavy floor lamp, ripping the cord from the socket, intending to use the base as a battering ram against the window eye. The movement cost me precious focus, and my eyes watered uncontrollably, forcing a long, dragging blink. The floor tilted, pitching me sideways, and the walls slammed inward another 6 inches with a deafening crunch. The television screen shattered, imploding under the pressure, sending shards of plastic and glass skittering across the floor. I swung the lamp base at the milky window, the metal connecting with a sickeningly wet thud rather than the crash of breaking glass. The object bounced back, vibrating in my hands, leaving a bruise on the white surface that healed itself within seconds. I was trapped in a digestive tract, not a room, and I was the irritant that needed to be broken down. Desperation drove me to the center of the remaining space, crouching low, trying to make myself as small a target as possible. I stared at the ceiling, watching the stucco pattern swirl and rearrange itself into shapes that looked like screaming faces. My eyes were failing me, the dryness turning into an agonizing scratching, vision tunneling into a gray vignette. I tried to pry my eyelids open with my fingers, digging my nails into the sensitive skin of my brow. I needed moisture. I needed drops. But the bottle had rolled under the sofa, which was now being crushed into splinters by the advancing wall. A sound from the corner drew my attention, a wet tearing noise that rose above the structural groans of the apartment. Where the walls met in the far corner, the plaster had split open, revealing pulsating red muscle fiber beneath the paint. It wasn't just that the room was shrinking. The room was revealing its true anatomy, shedding its camouflage. A tendril of wet, red tissue slithered out of the crack, testing the air like a snake's tongue. I scrambled to the opposite side, pressing my back against the door again, my breath coming in short, sobbing gasps. The realization hit me that I couldn't win this staring contest against a supernatural predator that manipulated space. I had to change the variables, so I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen glowing with a low battery warning. I tried to dial emergency services again, but my fingers were slick, and the numbers on the screen seemed to swim and rearrange themselves. I hit the call button anyway, pressing the device to my ear, praying for a dial tone. Instead of a ringing sound, I heard a voice that sounded like my own, but distorted and slowed down, whispering, "Close them." I hurled the phone at the exposed muscle in the corner, a useless gesture of defiance that achieved nothing but depriving me of light. The screen cracked and went dark, plunging the room into a heavy, suffocating twilight illuminated only by the weird bioluminescence of the window. The shadows in the room deepened, becoming solid entities that seemed to reach out for my ankles. I slapped at my face, trying to induce pain to stay awake, to keep my eyes wide. But the exhaustion was a heavy blanket. My head nodded forward, and my eyes snapped shut for 2 full seconds. The floor buckled upward, throwing me onto my side, and the walls rushed in with the speed of a closing car crusher. I curled into a fetal ball, my knees touching my chin, as the space constricted to the size of a walk-in closet. The furniture was gone, ground into dust or absorbed into the flesh of the walls, leaving only me and the pulsing heat. I could feel the texture of the walls pressing against my back and knees now, soft, yet incredibly strong. It felt like being inside a mouth that was slowly closing, the tongue pushing me toward the throat. I screamed, thrashing against the confinement, my fists pounding against the surfaces that were now pressing against me from all sides. There was no room to stand, no room to extend my legs. I was boxed in by the impossible architecture. The air was hot and wet, smelling of old meat, and the thrumming heart sound was deafening, vibrating through my skull. I knew that one more blink, one more moment of darkness, would be the end. I would be crushed, integrated into the walls, just another layer of insulation for the next tenant. In the darkness of my confinement, a strange clarity began to wash over me, a cold acceptance of the nightmare's logic. I realized that the blinking wasn't just a trigger for the movement. It was the only way the room could feed. It required the cessation of observation to alter reality, utilizing the quantum uncertainty I had read about in college. As long as I looked, the wave function couldn't collapse. The reality couldn't shift to its final, lethal state. But I was human, and humans were built with a flaw. We cannot watch forever. My eyes were bleeding now, tears of blood mixing with the saline and sweat, running down my cheeks into my mouth. The salt taste was sharp and grounding, a final tether to a reality that was rapidly dissolving. I tried to wedge my elbows against the walls to create space for my chest to expand, to take one more breath. The walls yielded slightly, spongy and gross, but pushed back with equal force. A hydraulic press of meat. I could hear the bones in my forearms creaking under the strain. The radius and ulna bowing under the pressure. A whisper brushed against my ear, originating from the wall, pressed against the side of my head. "Let go," it said, the voice sounding like grinding stones and rustling dry leaves. "It only hurts because you resist the integration." I shook my head, scraping my forehead against the rough texture of the enclosure, refusing to accept the invitation. I bit my tongue, hard, flooding my mouth with copper, using the sharp spike of pain to force my eyes open wider. They felt like they were bulging out of their sockets, dried grapes ready to burst. Suddenly, the pressure alleviated for a microsecond, the walls retracting an inch as if the room was taking a breath. It was a trap, a biological feint designed to make me relax, to make me lower my guard. I didn't fall for it, keeping my muscles tense, my gaze fixed on the darkness in front of me. But the reprieve was followed by a sudden drop in temperature. The sweltering heat replaced by a bone-chilling cold. The sweat on my skin turned to ice, shivering, racking my body, shaking my vision, making the darkness tremble. I felt something wrap around my ankle, a wet, muscular cord that tightened with crushing force. I kicked out, my heel connecting with something soft that squelched, but the grip didn't loosen. It began to pull, dragging me downward, though there should have been floor beneath me. The floor had become permeable, a quicksand of flesh that was swallowing my legs. I clawed at the walls, my fingernails tearing into the soft surface, bringing away handfuls of gray, fibrous matter. The sinking sensation was nauseating, a vertigo that spun the world on an axis that shouldn't exist. I was buried up to my waist now, the room digesting me from the bottom up. I tilted my head back, looking up into the narrowing shaft of the room, searching for a glimmer of light. There was none, only the oppressive weight of the entity that had worn the mask of an apartment. I realized then that the brain wasn't lying, but it had been protecting me from a truth too vast to comprehend. I was not in a room. I was in an organ, a microscopic intruder in a cosmic body that I had mistaken for a home. The blinking was merely the tick of the immune system, the pulses of a white blood cell closing in on a virus. I laughed then, a broken, hysterical sound that bubbled up from my compressed chest. The absurdity of it all shattered my last reserve of fear, replacing it with a bleak nihilism. I had fought against the inevitable functions of a biology so much larger than my own. The grip around my waist tightened, squeezing the air from my lungs, stopping my diaphragm from descending. My vision began to gray out, not from the blinking, but from hypoxia, the lack of oxygen starving my brain. Starbursts of light exploded behind my retinas, beautiful and terrifying, signaling the end of consciousness. I fought to keep my eyes open, but the muscles were paralyzed, the signals from my brain no longer reaching the nerves. The darkness was creeping in from the periphery, a closing aperture. I felt the walls touch my shoulders, the ceiling press against the top of my head, compressing my spine. The space was now a suit of armor made of crushing force, molding me into a shape that would fit the digestion chamber. My left arm snapped with a sound like a gunshot, pain exploding white-hot and blinding. The scream died in my throat, crushed before it could form sound. I was being unmade, folded like origami into a simplified geometry. In the final moment, as the pressure became absolute, I understood the nature of the shift. It wasn't moving closer. I was becoming part of it. The boundaries between observer and environment dissolving. My eyes, dry and ruined, finally surrendered to the overwhelming command of biology. I felt the eyelids descend, a slow curtain call on a stage that had already burned down. The darkness was total, absolute, and surprisingly warm. As my eyes closed, the crushing stopped, replaced by a sensation of floating in a viscous fluid. I waited for death, for the final oblivion, but consciousness persisted in the dark. I could hear the heart again, but now it was all around me, a thunderous rhythm that synced with my own fading pulse. I tried to open my eyes, to check the room one last time, to verify my existence. But I had no eyes to open. They had been absorbed, repurposed for the greater structure. I was the wall now. I was the floor. I was the peeling beige paint and the thrumming heat. I felt a vibration, a disturbance in the air, a sense of something new entering the space. I focused my attention, or what was left of it, on the center of the room. I couldn't see, but I could feel the presence of an intruder, a new virus. I sensed the rapid heartbeat of a person standing in the center of the studio apartment. I felt their fear radiating like heat waves, their shallow breathing tasting of panic. They were looking at the television stand, wondering why it seemed closer than it should be. I waited, patient and hungry, part of the geometry now. I waited for them to blink. The cycle was beginning again, and I was no longer the victim. I was the mechanism. I felt the dry itch of their eyes as if it were my own memory echoing in the plaster. They reached for a bottle of eye drops, their hand trembling, knocking over a stack of mail. I shifted the coffee table an inch closer, anticipating the moment of their blindness. "Don't blink," I tried to whisper, but the sound came out as the settling groan of the floorboards. The intruder jumped, terrified, and stared wildly at the walls. I felt a pang of sympathy, a ghost of humanity. But the hunger of the room was stronger. It demanded space, it demanded matter, and it demanded observation to cease. The intruder's eyes were watering, the strain becoming unbearable for them. I prepared the ceiling to drop, gathering the kinetic energy required for the shift. It was a mercy, really, to end it quickly, to bring them into the fold. We would be together in the walls, a chorus of silent screamers holding up the roof. They squeezed their eyes shut, a single tear rolling down their cheek. I lurched forward, the room contracting with joyous violence. The game continued. My brain hadn't been lying, and neither was theirs. We were just food for the architecture.